reading is from a speech by Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. on April 4th, 1967, called Beyond Vietnam. This is his main speech where he turned his attention from civil rights to the Vietnam War. This call for a worldwide fellowship that lifts neighborly concern beyond one's tribe, race, class, and nation is in reality a call for an all-embracing and unconditional love for all mankind. This oft misunderstood, this oft misinterpreted concept, so readily dismissed by the Nietzsches of the world as a weak and cowardly force, has now become an absolute necessity for the survival of man. When I speak of love, I am not speaking of some sentimental and weak response. I'm not speaking of that force which is just emotional bosh. I'm speaking of that force which all of the great religions have seen as the supreme unifying principle of life. Love is somehow the key that unlocks the door which leads to ultimate reality. This Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist belief about ultimate reality is beautifully summed up in the first epistle of St. John. Let us love one another, for love is God. And everyone that loveth is born of God and knoweth God. He that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love. If we love one another, God dwelleth in us, and his love is perfected in us. Let us hope that this spirit will become the order of the day. I am reminded of the story of the rural church in Vermont in the middle of a huge snowstorm on a Sunday morning. And the minister dug his vehicle out, but thinking that nobody would actually show up to church. The minister did show up to church, and one farmer straggled in. And so the minister greeted the farmer at the door and said, "What do you want to do?" And the farmer says, "Well, Pastor, if I go out to feed my cows and only one cow shows up, I still feed that cow." The minister takes his cue and gets up in the pulpit, gets actually really into his subject, and goes on and preaches his heart out. Finally gets down and shakes hands with the farmer at the back door and says, "How was it?" "Well, Pastor, when I go out to feed my cows, if only one cow shows up, I still feed that cow. But Pastor, I don't feed them the whole load." Loving the other. Today is Valentine's Day, and we are in the middle of a conversation on race. What do the two have to do with each other? Let's start with the story of St. Valentine. It is, of course, shrouded in legend, and who knows what of it is true. But the story goes, in the 2nd century of the Common Era, a cruel Roman emperor named Claudius was concerned because he was running out of soldiers. Claudius was making war on almost everybody around, but he couldn't raise a big enough army. He realized that the young men of Rome would rather make love than war. So he decreed that no marriages could take place in this time of emergency. But Valentine circumvented this decree and went on marrying couples in secret. For this he was arrested, tried, and put to death. Since his martyrdom, he has become canonized and is the patron saint of lovers. Amor vincit omnia, said Virgil. Love conquers all. We like to think so. In 1935, the Universalists adopted a statement avowing a faith in God as eternal and all-conquering love. Love, we like to say, is the most powerful force in the universe. It is also one of the most debased, common, cheap, vulgar words in the language. Most pop tunes are about love. The headlines you see from supermarket tabloids are about love in a sense. Yet Dr. King said love was that force which all of the great religions have seen as the supreme unifying principle of life. Love is somehow the key that unlocks the door, which leads to ultimate reality. The love that is represented by God in universalist theology is much broader than the love which would induce people to get married, but it includes such love. Christian thought is often distinguished between love as eros, erotic love, and love as agape, a selfless love for all humankind, supposedly exemplified by Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. The problem with this distinction is that too often the erotic is deemed bad, while the agape is good. I happen to believe that our sexual instincts are holy, one of the great gifts of being human, and one of the ways that Orthodox Christianity went off the rails is with the hang-up on sex, which started with St. Augustine. Last week I talked about original sin. Augustine thought it was fair and just for all humans to suffer for Adam and Eve's bite at the apple, because all human reproduction is tied up in the sexual act, and that is inherently sinful, so we are each born through sin. This is why the hell he envisions contains babies and people with developmental difficulties. I respectfully but firmly disagree with this picture. Let me invite you to take a look at the couple on your order of service cover. Don't they look like a loving couple? They are. Literally. This is Richard and Mildred Loving. Let me tell you their story, as recounted by that great authority, Wikipedia. He was what society calls white, and she was of African American and Native American ancestry. They both lived in Virginia, which had a law on the books, which outlawed marriage between so-called white and so-called colored people. They had a relationship, and she became pregnant. Because of the Virginia law, they went to Washington, D.C. to get married. But then they returned to a small town in Virginia to live. And here's where it gets kind of incredible from the point of view of 2016. Apparently their interracial marriage attracted some attention there, so someone ratted them out to the police. The police raided the Loving's house in the middle of the night, hoping to catch them having sex. They were sleeping, in fact. But when Mildred was questioned about her marriage status, she pointed to the marriage certificate, which hung on their bedroom wall. This became the evidence used to convict them of the crime of going out of state to evade the state miscegenation laws. They were convicted in 1959 and sentenced, get this, sentenced each to serve 1 year in prison, but the sentences were suspended provided they moved out of state, which they did. But the Lovings soon found it burdensome that they could not visit relatives in Virginia. They were in Washington, D.C. They consulted the ACLU, which brought a case attacking their conviction and sentence. When the case reached the U.S. Supreme Court in 1967, it resulted in a unanimous decision holding that marriage was a fundamental and highly personal right, and any laws restricting marriage on account of race were invalid. The Loving versus Virginia holding would make St. Valentine proud. The emperor, or his successor, the state, has no business telling people whom they can and cannot marry. Last summer's decision in Obergefell, allowing same-sex marriage across the country, was based on Loving versus Virginia. As you may recall, we celebrated that decision with rainbow sherbet on the front lawn. Hard to think about that today, isn't it? And with the legal barriers removed, people of different so-called races did fall in love and get married. Quote, in the 2010 census, 10% of opposite-sex married couples had partners of a different race. 10% in the 2010 census. 25 times more than in 1960. Right here in this tiny church family, We have interracial marriages, and many of our families have them. When I was growing up, my elders used to worry about racial purity and bloodlines. As far as I'm concerned, we cannot move away from this narrow and delusional fiction called race quickly enough. The fallacy of thinking that there are races is shown when you ask a person who is the child of a white mother and a black father, like our current president, to check off a box on a form for race. That's like asking, who do you love more, your father or your mother? No one should ever ask a question like that, because it is impossible to answer. I go back to what my Buddhism professor said at divinity school. All religion stems from the realization the other is somehow like me. But before we get to that realization, there are powerful forces trying to convince us that the other is not like us, that the other is subhuman. A good definition of the other is the class of persons we are taught to fear. I mentioned last week Tandeka, our African-American UU theologian. She wrote a book about how we construct a white identity called Learning to be White. And she identifies an important component of this identity in a bargain the Southern elites made with the poor whites. The racism that accompanied slavery, and survives it to this day, assigned to blacks a permanent lower status based on their coloring, and this gave poor whites a stake in the whole hierarchical system. They were victims of its violence and its suffering, but they also gave their allegiance and set about, after emancipation, to keep blacks in an inferior position because it gave these poor whites some social status. Huck Finn's father's tirade against educated blacks from Huckleberry Finn is a classic statement of this anxious resentment. Loving the other. There are actually two kinds of other I think we encounter in our consciousness, the alien other and the intimate other. The alien other is someone outside our normal experience, some personal class of people that we really know very little about. For the first European explorers on these shores, the Native Americans were alien to them, and vice versa. The intimate other, by contrast, is someone we know quite a bit about, but who has chosen some path that we do not quite agree with. Let me give you an example. In the Cold War, the Soviets were the alien enemy. We knew of them largely through caricatures. Most Americans had never met a real Russian face to face. But in the McCarthy era, the supposed communists in the film and entertainment and news and government provoked the country to hysteria. People we knew from the silver screen, people we had records for, like Pete Seeger. They were spat on as traitors. That was the intimate other. Now, I'll go back a little bit in history. The Essenes were a sect in first century Palestine, which is known to us through the Dead Sea Scrolls. Like all the Jews in that area, they were cruelly oppressed by the Romans. Their writing shows an obsession with good and evil, and they conceive they are locked in a cosmic, apocalyptic conflict. But according to scholar Elaine Pagels, in their literature, if you analyze it, while they detest Israel's traditional enemies, who they call the Kittim, probably a coded epithet for the Romans, they struggle far more bitterly against their fellow Israelites who belong to the congregation of Beliar. The intimate enemy is the one whom you expect to be on your side, but seems to be actually working with your opponent, the traitor. For Jesus' audience, one intimate enemy were the Samaritans. We have to understand this if we're to understand the story of the Good Samaritan, one of Jesus' central teachings on love. The Samaritans were a people hated by the Jews. They worshiped Yahweh, but also local tribal gods, so they were considered apostates. In a passage one chapter before the Good Samaritan story in the Gospel of Luke, the Samaritans reject Jesus as he and his disciples are going through Samaria, and disciples ask him if they should call down the fire of heaven against the Samaritans. So they were not a popular lot. Now to the story. In the prologue of the Good Samaritan story, Jesus is asked by a lawyer what one must do to inherit eternal life. Jesus in turn asks him what is written in the law. And the lawyer responds, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Jesus accepts the rule as the lawyer has stated and tells him to do this. But the lawyer, as lawyers are wont to do, had a quibble about the terms of the rule. Who is my neighbor? Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan to answer this question. A traveler on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho is robbed and left for dead. Presumably he is Jewish, and thus he is a member of the tribe of Israel. A priest and a Levite passed him by on the other side. But a Samaritan took pity on him, bound his wounds, brought him to an inn, and paid to lodge him there. Which one was the neighbor? Asked Jesus. The priests and the Levites were supposed to be the guardians of the law, but they were not a neighbor to the injured man. Only the Samaritan, the person who was despised by the Jews, actually acts as a neighbor, actually goes out of his way to help. The idea that a Samaritan would be a better neighbor than a priest or Levite would have been shocking to a first century audience. As shocking as the story of Wesley Autry in 2007. Wesley Autry was an African-American construction worker, and he was on a subway platform with his two daughters when he saw a young white man having a seizure. He managed to get a pin into the man's mouth to prevent him from choking, but the man then rolled off the platform onto the tracks. With the train approaching, Autry got a bystander to restrain his children and dove off the platform, but he could not get the man off the tracks in time. So he covered him in a drainage ditch beside the track until the train had come to a stop. It was so close there was grease on his hat from the bottom of the train. The accolades poured in, medals for courage, donated cars, a presidential invitation to the State of the Union speech, and even a $10,000 gift from Donald Trump. He wrote the story up for Time magazine. It made a big splash, you see, for Autry's heroic actions upset two stereotypes, that blacks don't care about whites and that New Yorkers don't care about strangers. Loving the other. Whether we follow Jesus or the Buddha or Dr. King, I think that is what we're called to do. The alien other and the intimate other, but they're on two different planes. As we've been talking about race, we have been talking about race, but this analysis applies to any other thing that might divide people. We start with self-love, but anything beyond that involves us with another. It's Valentine's Day. The number one person in my life is my wife. I love her and have to make that love new every day. As well as I have gotten to know her over the 15 years of our marriage, there are still parts of her which are undiscovered territory. And before Jacqueline, I was married to Lee, my first wife, for 27 years, and learned something new about her every day, too. We had been high school sweethearts, so she was from an almost identical background, while Jacqueline came from a different path. Both have required constant adjustments. Some people try to marry someone who's just like them, and some people try to marry someone who's very different. If what attracts you is the person's exoticism, you find out that this is what goes away very quickly as you get used to another person. When I was in my mid-20s, I had an African-American friend. He taught at the same school as Lee, and he and his wife became fast social friends for a few months. We went on double dates, did many movies, downed many beers, and stayed up half the night trying to solve the problems of the world. It was a lot of fun. As I realized this friendship was developing, I wondered whether the better I got to know Steve as an individual, the less I would see his race. That didn't happen, and I didn't understand why until many years later. In my theology class at Harvard Divinity School, we had a guest appearance by Cornel West, the great race theorist. When it came time for questions, I asked Dr. West, when we reach heaven, or in the ideal beloved community, and I encounter you, will I still see a black man? He answered me, yes, because a black man is what I am. I would not be who I am without being black. I think my expectation of my friend Steve was that I wanted him to become white so that I could love him more easily. And that's not good enough. That's not good enough love. I needed to learn to love him as he is. And I did. What turned out to be wrong was not the way I loved him, but my expectations. Getting to know people as individuals combats one of the big components of fear, that is stereotypes. They haunt our culture. African Americans are said to love watermelon, to have natural rhythm, to be lazy and shiftless and dumb and easily fooled and yet sly and deceitful. And the men have great sexual powers and the women are easy and available, and the list goes on and on. The stereotype that African American women were sensual in particular was used to justify adultery and rape in slavery times and afterwards. When we get to know and love real individuals, we understand that these stereotypes are simply ghosts. Of direct relevance to police killings, there's a stereotype that black men are more dangerous than white men. This is motivated by fear as well as guilt. During slavery, white Southerners lived with a constant fear of slave insurrection. Why wouldn't the slaves revolt if given the chance? Anyone would. So the structure of society was designed not to give them that chance. Are we still haunted by the fear of armed black men? The Black Panthers played on this in their images in the 1960s. And Beyonce referred to these images in her halftime show at the Super Bowl last weekend. Several liberal commentators have noted that if a lot of African Americans started carrying heat in their open carry states, the whole context of the gun control debate will shift. I searched for something concrete to do about this fear of the dangerous black man. For I think it is this fear that drives some of these police killings, which are perceived as such an injustice. The first epistle of John says, perfect love casts out all fear. But I don't know how you can teach love to police officers. And if you could, I'm not sure I want a fearless police force. Let me put in a good word for fear. Evolution has given us fear instincts that for the most part do a pretty good job of keeping us safe. We stay indoors when the winds are too high or the snow is too deep to walk safely, or at least sensible people do. We entrust our police with keeping the community safe, and so we hope they have the instincts to alert them to possible threats before they happen. So evolution gives us a basic set of good instincts, but our peculiar history grafts onto this set of instincts an arbitrary division of the human species by skin color and hair type, and imbues that division with all kinds of significance it does not really have. This is a source of massive injustice, which people of color live under every day. Let me ask you, do you get uneasy when you're in a group of people where blacks outnumber whites? Do you feel threatened? If you see a black man on the street while you're in your car, do you mentally check to see if the door is locked? If you have those feelings as a white person who claims to be beyond racism, can you imagine what it is like to be that black person, just walking on the street while everyone around you is checking to make sure their doors are locked? What does Valentine's Day have to do with race? Everything. The way out of the trap of racism, I'm convinced, is love. Not just the heart, but the mind must be engaged too. We need to be able to see ourselves as others see us, and to walk a mile in the other person's shoes. Loving the other means looking at what we do and say from the other person's point of view. Loving the other means a commitment to tear down this false system of race, but it also means not declaring it torn down when it is still very much active. I try to adopt love as my guide, to recognize in the other some essence or spark that is like me, but not to try to make the other into my image. Love at this level, as in marriage, as in church or community life, is not easy.